3 weeks before our wedding, my fiancée slid a folder across the kitchen table and asked me to sign a prenup. She said it lightly. She said the words, just in case, and she smiled when she said them. The way you smile when you're pretending something is smaller than it is. I wasn't upset. That's the part one keep coming back to. I thought it was reasonable. Nicole had a business. I had savings. We were both in our 30s and had watched enough friends' marriages come apart to know that love and paperwork are two different things. I told her I'd read it over the weekend. She kissed me and said thank you and went to take a call in the other room. I did read it that weekend. And because I read it carefully, because one clause didn't make sense, I ended up making a phone call I was never supposed to make. That phone call is where my real marriage ended, 3 weeks before it legally began. Let me tell you about Nicole, because if I don't, none of this will make sense. And because for a long time, I would have told you she was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I need you to understand that I believe that all the way down. We met 4 years before the prenup at a mutual friend's barbecue. She was funny in a dry, quick way that made you feel like you'd been let in on something. She ran a small interior design business, real clients, real invoices, a little studio downtown with her name on the glass. I'm an engineer. I build water treatment systems for municipalities, which is exactly as unglamorous as it sounds. And I had spent most of my adult life assuming that women like Nicole ended up with men more interesting than me. When she picked me, I felt chosen in a way I hadn't since I was a kid picked for a team. I know how that sounds. I'm telling you anyway, because that feeling is relevant to everything that came after. A man who feels lucky to be chosen stops asking certain questions. He doesn't want to look too closely at the gift. We moved in together after a year. It was easy. We were good roommates before we were anything else, which people underrate. She traveled a fair amount for work, sourcing trips, client installs in other cities, design conferences. I traveled some too, out to job sites for weeks at a stretch. We had the kind of relationship where two independent people orbited each other and came home glad. I thought that was maturity. I thought the space between us was a sign of trust. I proposed on a Tuesday, no big production, in our own living room, because she'd once told me she hated public proposals. She cried. She said yes. We started planning a small wedding, 60 people, a rented barn an hour outside the city. For about 8 months, I was as happy as I have ever been. Then, 3 weeks out, the folder came across the table. Here's the thing about the prenup that I want to be fair about. I did not object to the concept. A prenup is not a betrayal. Plenty of solid marriages start with one, and anyone who tells you asking for one is a red flag has never watched a divorce turn two reasonable people into enemies over a sofa. If Nicole had asked me a year earlier, calmly, as part of a normal conversation about merging two adult lives, I'd have said smart, let's do it, and meant it. What snagged me wasn't the prenup. It was the timing, and it was one specific clause, and it was the particular lightness in her voice when she said just in case, a lightness I had heard before, I realized, in other moments, always attached to things that turned out not to be light at all. I took the folder to my home office that Saturday, made a pot of coffee, and started reading it like the engineer I am, line by line. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect, how we'd divide what we came in with, how we'd handle the business, what happened to the apartment. Boilerplate, careful, unremarkable. I initialed the bottom of each page in my head, already halfway to signing. And then, on page 4, there was a sentence about a pre-existing legal entanglement that both parties acknowledged and agreed to hold separate. A pre-existing legal entanglement. I read it 3 times. In my line of work, you learn that the most important part of any specification is the clause that's written vaguely on purpose. The one where somebody is trying to get something past you without saying it out loud. This was that clause. It didn't fit. Everything else in the document was specific. Dollar amounts, account numbers, the make and model of her car. This one sentence was fog. I did not know what it meant. And I had a feeling, cold and immediate, that I was not supposed to. I want to explain how a careful person misses things for years, because I've thought about it a great deal, and I think it matters more than the betrayal itself. You don't miss things because you're stupid. You miss them because you've decided, in advance, what kind of story you're living in. I had decided Nicole and I were a good, modern, trusting couple, and every piece of evidence got filed under that heading. Her frequent travel, independence, her separate bank accounts. She's a business owner. That's just prudent. The fact that I had never met her family. She told me early on that she was estranged from them, a painful subject, and I'd respected that and never pushed. The fact that in 4 years I had met exactly two people who'd known her longer than I had. All of it filed under Nicole as a private, self-made woman who had a hard start. Every anomaly had a kind explanation, and I'd reach for the kind one every single time. Because the alternative was to be the kind of man who investigates the woman he loves. That phrase, pre-existing legal entanglement, was the first thing I couldn't file. It didn't fit under any of my kind headings. I turned it over for a full day, trying to make it mean something ordinary, and it wouldn't. That's the moment a story starts to crack. Not when you find the big thing, but when you find the small thing your explanations can't absorb. I did the reasonable thing first. I asked her. Sunday morning, coffee. I kept it casual. I said, "Hey, page 4 mentions a pre-existing legal thing we're holding separate. What's that about?" And I watched her face, and for just a second, less than a second, something moved behind her eyes. Then she smiled and said it was a boilerplate clause her lawyer put in, something about an old business partnership that had a lingering liability, nothing to worry about. She'd have him take it out if it bothered me. It was a good answer. It was smooth and specific, and it came with an offer to remove the very thing that had alarmed me, which is a classic move. You defuse suspicion by volunteering to erase its source. If I'd been the man I was a year earlier, I'd have said, "Oh, okay, sure," and we'd have moved on, and I'd have married her 3 weeks later, and I might never have known. But that single flicker behind her eyes had done something to me. I'd seen it. And once you've actually seen the thing your story told you wasn't there, you can't unsee it. It sits in the room with you. So I said, "Sure, have him take it out, no big deal." And I meant something completely different than what I said. I meant, I'm going to find out what that clause is protecting, and I am going to do it quietly, and you are never going to know I looked. I'm not proud of the deception, but I'll tell you honestly, I'd spent 4 years being lied to. I would later learn, and the 3 weeks I spent lying back are the only 3 weeks in the whole story I don't feel guilty about. I want to name something here, because I think a lot of you have felt it and been ashamed of it. There is a specific shame in deciding to investigate the person you love. It feels like a betrayal in itself. You think, if I'm the kind of man who checks, maybe I don't deserve her. Maybe I'm the problem. That shame is exactly what keeps people not looking for years. I felt it that whole afternoon. I felt like a bad man for opening a laptop. I did it anyway, and I want to tell you that the shame was a lie. One more lie in a house already full of them. And the moment I understood that was the moment I started to get free. That afternoon, while she was at a client meeting, I opened her lawyer's name from the folder and started there. Not to accuse, just to understand the shape of a sentence I wasn't supposed to be able to read. The lawyer was a dead end, professionally. He wasn't going to discuss his client with her fiancé, and I didn't ask him to. But his firm's name told me which county the prenup had been drafted in, and that gave me a starting thread. I'm an engineer. I don't know how to interrogate people, but I know how to follow a system back to its source, and legal marriage in this country is, at bottom, a system of public records. Here's a thing most people don't know until they need to. In most states, marriage is a matter of public record. You can search it. Names, dates, county of filing. It's designed to be findable because the whole point of a legal marriage is that it's declared to the world. I started with the assumption that pre-existing legal entanglement might mean a marriage Nicole had never told me about, an old one, from before me, that had maybe never been properly dissolved. That would be embarrassing to disclose, easy to bury in legal language, and exactly the kind of thing a prenup might quietly wall off. It was an ugly thought, but it was a manageable one. Lots of people have a messy first marriage they'd rather not discuss. So on Sunday night, after Nicole had gone to bed, I sat in my office with the door closed and the desk lamp low, and I searched public marriage records for her name. My hands were not quite steady on the keyboard. I remember that. I remember thinking, right up until the results loaded, that I was being paranoid, that I'd find nothing, that I'd feel foolish and relieved and go to bed and marry this woman in 3 weeks and tell her someday, laughing. About the night, I got weird about a boilerplate clause. I found one, but the date was wrong. It wasn't from before me. It wasn't an old marriage from her 20s that she'd forgotten to finalize the divorce on. The marriage record I found was dated 14 months earlier. 14 months. We had been engaged for 8 months at that point, which meant this marriage, this legal marriage, filed and recorded and real, had happened while we were together, while we were living in the same apartment, while I thought we were building toward the barn and the 60 guests and the rest of our lives. The name of the man she'd married was not one I recognized, and the place of filing wasn't our county or our state. It was Utah County, Utah, a place neither of us had ever lived, a place I was fairly sure Nicole had never set foot in. I sat there staring at the screen with a very specific feeling I'd never had before and hope you never have. It's the feeling of your own memory becoming untrustworthy. Because I was there 14 months ago, I could remember that stretch of our life. I remembered a trip she'd taken that spring, a design conference, she'd said, a long weekend. I remembered picking her up at the airport. I remembered that she'd seemed happy and a little keyed up when she got back, and I'd thought it was the conference. I did not sleep that night. I lay next to my fiancée, my legally someone else wife fiancée, and listened to her breathe the slow, easy breath of a person with nothing on her conscience, and I stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out how a woman marries a stranger in a state she's never been to without ever leaving town for more than a weekend. I ran the logistics in my head the way I'd run a failure analysis at work. A flight would leave a trail. A hotel would leave a trail. Utah is not close. She'd been gone that spring for exactly one long weekend, and I'd picked her up at the airport myself, and the airline she'd flown didn't even serve Salt Lake City on a direct route. The pieces didn't fit any physical version of events, which meant the event wasn't physical. The answer, when I found it the next day, was almost worse than the question. She'd done it online. I want to explain this, because I didn't know it was possible either, and it changed how I understood the whole thing. Utah County, Utah, offers legally binding marriage ceremonies conducted entirely over video call. It started as a convenience during the years when nobody could gather in person, and it never went away because it turned out to be extraordinarily useful. You can be anywhere in the world. Your officiant is in Utah. You get on a video call, you say the words, and you are, in the eyes of United States law and most of the world, married. A real marriage. A real certificate. Fully legal, fully recognized, and obtainable from your living room in under an hour. Nicole had married a man over a video call while I was, presumably, at work. I found the man's name on the certificate, Adnan, a surname I won't share. When I searched him, the picture filled in fast, because he wasn't hiding. He had no reason to hide. He probably didn't know I existed. He was a citizen of another country, living abroad. Professional looking, maybe a few years younger than me. LinkedIn, a couple of public profiles, photos from what looked like an ordinary, decent life thousands of miles away. He did not look like a criminal or a schemer. He looked like a guy. That was the first crack in the story I was building, though I didn't understand its meaning yet. I just filed a small, quiet note that the man in the photos did not match the villain I was drawing in my head. And that's when the shape of it finally turned over in my mind and showed me its underside. This wasn't an affair. I'd been braced for an affair, some other man here in the city, secret hotel rooms, the ordinary, devastating thing. This was not that. Nicole was not in love with a man in another country. She had almost certainly never met him in person. What this was, I came to understand over the following days of very careful digging, was a transaction. Adnan needed something that a marriage to an American citizen provides: a legal pathway, a status, the specific set of doors that a U.S. marriage opens for a foreign national. And Nicole had something to sell: her citizenship, her signature, an hour of her time on a video call, and a willingness to keep it completely hidden. I don't know the exact price. I never got the full number. But I found enough: a pattern of deposits into one of those separate business accounts, irregular, sized wrong for design work, starting right around the date of that design conference. To know that my fiancée had married a stranger for money and had been receiving payments ever since. The deposits weren't huge. That was almost the worst part. She hadn't done it out of desperation, some crisis that might have made it comprehensible. The amounts were modest and steady, the size of a side income, a supplemental thing, a stream she'd built into her life the way you'd build in a rental property. She had monetized a marriage the way other people monetize a spare room, and she'd done it while sleeping next to me and planning a wedding and letting me believe I was the whole of her secret heart. The prenup clause suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. A pre-existing legal entanglement that both parties acknowledge and agree to hold separate. She wasn't protecting her business from me. She was building a legal wall around the fact that she was already married to someone else, so that when it inevitably surfaced, and these things surface, our marriage and my assets and my exposure would be technically insulated from the fraud she was committing. She wasn't asking me to protect her money. She was asking me to unknowingly sign a document that helped protect her from the consequences of a crime. And she'd smiled when she said, "Just in case." I need to tell you about the 4 days between finding out and saying anything, because those 4 days are the strangest of my life. And if you've ever known something enormous that the other person didn't know you knew, you understand exactly the state I'm describing. I went to work. I ate dinner across from her. I discussed the wedding. 3 weeks out, there are 100 small decisions. The final head count for the caterer, whether her cousin could bring a +1, what time the shuttle should leave the hotel. I made those decisions with her. I said, "Sounds good, babe," about a shuttle for a wedding I already knew would never happen. I sat with her one of those nights and helped her finalize the seating chart, physically moving little paper names around a printed diagram of a barn, putting her friends near the dance floor and my aunt away from the speakers. And the whole time I was thinking, none of these people will ever sit in these chairs. I have never in my life been so calm on the outside and so completely detonated on the inside. Part of it was strategy, and I'll own that. I'd learned, reading that prenup, that Nicole was a person who could make a lie sound like the most reasonable thing in the world. If I confronted her with what I knew, she would have an explanation ready before I finished the sentence. She'd had explanations ready my entire relationship. So I wanted more than a marriage certificate. I wanted to understand the full scope before I gave her the chance to start shaping the story. Once she knew I was looking, the looking would be over. But part of it, honestly, was grief. Because in those 4 days I wasn't just gathering evidence. I was saying goodbye. Every ordinary moment. Her laughing at something on TV, the way she left her coffee cup exactly where she always left it, the specific weight of her head on my shoulder on the couch. I was experiencing each of these for what I now knew was the last time, while she experienced them as Tuesday. There's a particular loneliness in mourning a relationship while the other person still thinks it's alive. You're at the funeral. They think it's dinner. I want to say something to you directly here, because I suspect some of you are living in a version of those 4 days right now. Maybe you've seen something you can't unsee. A phone that turns face down. An account you're not supposed to look at. A story that stopped adding up. And you're carrying it alone, wondering if you're crazy, wondering if confronting it will blow up a life you're not ready to lose. I can't tell you what you'll find, but I can tell you that the 4 days I spent knowing were worse than everything that came after. The knowing and not saying is a kind of poison. Whatever's on the other side of the conversation, it is more survivable than living inside the silence. I promise you that. On the 4th day, I made copies of everything. The certificate, The deposit records, Adnan's public information, screenshots of the whole architecture. I backed it up in 2 places, because the engineer in me doesn't trust a single copy of anything, and because some quiet instinct told me that once Nicole knew I had it, she might try very hard to make it disappear. I put a printed set in a folder, a real folder, manila, the same kind she'd slid across the table, and I decided that I would hand it back to her the same way she'd handed hers to me, across the kitchen table, lightly, just in case. I did it on a Thursday night. I asked her to sit down, that I wanted to talk about the prenup. Her whole body relaxed when I said the word prenup. I watched it happen. She thought this was the easy conversation, the one where I say I've read it. I'm fine with it. Let's sign. She probably thought her fiancé was about to prove, one more time, that he was the trusting, uncomplicated man she'd chosen precisely because he was trusting and uncomplicated. She sat down across from me, and she was almost cheerful. I slid the folder across the table. I didn't say anything at first. I just watched her open it. And I watched the exact moment the top page registered. The marriage certificate, her name, Adnan's name, Utah County, the date 14 months gone. I watched her face do the thing faces do when a life comes apart in real time. First confusion, then the frantic backstage calculation of a person searching for the explanation that will make this okay. And then, this is the part I'll never forget, I watched her not find one. I watched her reach for the reasonable, smooth, defusing answer that had worked her entire life, and I watched her come up empty. Because there is no reasonable, smooth answer to a document that says you married a stranger for money while planning a wedding to the man across the table. She said my name, just my name, like a question, as if I might be the one who owed her an explanation, as if I'd done something strange by knowing. I said, it's all in there. The deposits too. So don't tell me it was a mix-up. I kept my voice level. I had promised myself I would not yell, not because I'm a saint, but because I understood, in that moment, that the calm was the only power I had, and that the second I got loud she'd have something to work with. My anger, my instability, a way to make the conversation about how I was reacting instead of about what she'd done. So I stayed quiet. It turned out to be the most devastating thing I could have done. What followed was not the explosion I'd braced for. It was quieter and much sadder. She didn't deny it. I think she was too stunned to deny it. She'd never once, in 4 years, been caught, and I don't think she'd built the muscle for it. She started to explain, and the explanation kept changing shape as she talked, which is how I knew none of it was the real reason. First, it was money. She'd been in a rough patch with the business, debt I didn't know about, and this had been a way out. Then it was that it didn't mean anything. It was just paperwork. She'd never even met him. It had nothing to do with us. Then it was that she'd been planning to quietly dissolve it after the wedding, that it was almost over, that I'd found out right at the end of a thing she was already ending. Then, when none of those landed, it curdled into the version that told me the most. She said, "You were never supposed to know. It didn't affect you. It didn't affect us. It didn't affect us." She had committed marriage fraud, married another human being, hidden a whole second legal identity, taken money for years, and engineered a legal document to make me an unwitting shield. And in her mind, because I hadn't known, none of it had touched us. That was the sentence that ended it for me, not the fraud, the philosophy underneath it, the belief that a lie doesn't count as long as the other person never finds out, that reality is only what the other person can see. I told her the wedding was off. She said, "Ryan, please." I said the caterer would understand. I moved out that weekend. Not her, me. People always assume the betrayed person keeps the home, but the apartment was in her name from before we met, and I wanted, more than I wanted anything to be fair, to simply be gone. I took my clothes, my books, the good coffee grinder that was genuinely mine, and I went to my brother's place across town with 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box, 41 years old, feeling like a college kid moving out of a dorm after everything went wrong. My brother, Kevin, is 3 years older and has never once said, "I told you so," in his life, which is the highest compliment I can pay a man. He didn't say it now, even though he'd never fully warmed to Nicole, even though I later learned he'd had a vague unease about her for years that he'd kept to himself because I was happy and it wasn't his to wreck. He just cleared out his home office, put an air mattress in it, and told me I could stay as long as I needed. The first night, he ordered the sad, greasy food of male crisis, and we watched a baseball game and didn't talk about it. And it was exactly right. The grief hit in stages, and not the stages you'd expect. The first thing I mourned wasn't Nicole. It was the wedding. All that specific, hopeful machinery. The barn, the shuttle, the seating chart with 60 names on it, my own vows half written in a note on my phone. I had to make the calls. I called the caterer, the venue, the man who was going to marry us. I told each of them the wedding was canceled, and each of them said some version of, "I'm so sorry." And I said, "Thank you. These things happen," which is an insane thing to say about your fiancé secretly marrying a stranger, but I couldn't exactly explain, so I let them think it was an ordinary breakup. The second thing I mourned was harder. It was 4 years of my own memory, because now every good moment was suspect. That design conference was a wedding. What were the other trips? The birthday when she'd seemed distracted. Was that this? The night she took a call in the other room, Adnan? I found myself doing forensic work on my own happiness, exhuming good memories to check them for rot, and the worst part was I could never be sure. Some of them were probably real. She probably did love me, in whatever compartment she kept me in. But I would never again be able to hold a memory of us without also holding the question of what else was happening in the frame, just out of sight. There's a particular cruelty in that. A clean breakup lets you keep your past. You can say, "We were happy once, and then we weren't," and the happy part stays yours. This kind of betrayal steals even that. It goes back through your history and staples a question mark to every good day. I lost the wedding, I lost the woman, and then I lost the memories too, which is a third grief people don't talk about because it doesn't have a name. That's the thing nobody warns you about betrayal at this scale. It doesn't just take the future. It reaches back and poisons the past, so you're not grieving one relationship. You're grieving every version of the last 4 years, including the ones that were real. Kevin found me one night sitting on the air mattress at 2 a.m. just staring at the wall. He sat down next to me on the floor. He said, "You didn't miss it because you're a fool. You missed it because you're not the kind of person who'd do it. That's not a weakness." I've held on to that. It didn't fix anything that night, but I've held on to it. The next week, I went to see a lawyer of my own. Not a divorce lawyer. There was no marriage to divorce, which was its own strange mercy. I went because I needed to understand my exposure. I had, after all, nearly signed a document acknowledging a pre-existing legal entanglement. I needed to know if I was in any danger from what Nicole had done. The lawyer, a sharp, unhurried woman named Patricia, listened to the whole thing without a flicker. And believe me, I watch for the flicker because it's an insane story to say out loud in a quiet office to a stranger. She just took notes, asked a few precise questions, and then told me two things that reorganized my head. The first was that I was fine. I hadn't signed the prenup. I'd never been legally married to Nicole. Whatever crime she'd committed, I was a witness to it, not a party. My assets were mine. My name was clean. The near miss of that clause, the fact that I'd read page for carefully instead of skimming it like most people skim a document from someone they trust, had kept me out of a legal mess I might have spent years untangling. My own carefulness had saved me, and I would have signed it, I want to be honest, if that one sentence had been written a little more smoothly. That's the thin margin the whole thing turned on. One fog-worded clause, one careful reader, one Saturday with a pot of coffee. If her lawyer had buried it better, or if I'd trusted her the way I'd trusted her for 4 years, I'd have signed my name and married her and become a legal accessory to a fraud I didn't know existed. And I'd have found out about Adnan years later, married, maybe with kids, with everything to lose. Patricia said, flatly. "You have no idea how lucky you are that you read." I said I was starting to. The second thing she told me was the one I've thought about most. She set down her pen, looked at me, and said, "You have to decide whether to report it." Because what Nicole had done wasn't just a betrayal. Marriage fraud, specifically marrying a foreign national for money to help them obtain immigration status, is a federal crime. A serious one, with real prison exposure attached to it. And I was a person who could pick up a phone and in not just our relationship, but Nicole's freedom. Patricia was careful to say she wasn't advising me either way, that this was a moral question more than a legal one, and that plenty of people in my position report and plenty don't, and that both kinds of people sleep fine eventually. But she wanted me to understand that I was holding something heavier than a breakup. I was holding another person's life in my hand, and I got to decide what to do with the weight of it. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. Because I think the reason these stories land is that they're not really about the dramatic thing. They're about the ordinary person who has to decide who to be after the dramatic thing. That's the part we all share. Most of us will never find a secret marriage certificate. But most of us, at some point, get handed a moment where we could do real damage to someone who hurt us. And we have to decide what kind of person we're going to be when no one would blame us for the worst version. I sat with that decision for 2 weeks. I'm going to tell you what I chose and why. But first I have to tell you about the phone call I got in the middle of those 2 weeks. The one from a number I didn't recognize, from a man whose voice I'd never heard, calling from most of the way around the world. It was Adnan. I still don't fully know how he got my number. Nicole, probably, in a panic, trying to manage the two ends of a thing that was coming apart, the way people do when the walls they built between compartments start to fall. My phone rang with a long string of foreign digits, and something told me to answer, and a man's careful, accented, deeply nervous voice said, "Is this Ryan? I think we need to talk. I think we have both been lied to." We talked for over an hour, and it upended, one more time, the story I thought I understood. Because I'd built a picture in my head of Adnan as a co-conspirator, a man who'd knowingly bought an American wife, a willing partner in the fraud. That's not who was on the phone. What I got instead was a man as deceived as I was, in a different direction. Adnan had believed the marriage was real. Not real. He knew it had started as an arrangement. He was honest about that. He'd needed the immigration pathway and had entered into it with his eyes open on that count. But Nicole had told him a completely different story than the arrangement he thought he'd agreed to. She'd told him she was single. She'd told him that what began as paperwork had become something more, that she had feelings for him, that once his status was settled they might actually build something. She had been video calling him for over a year as a woman falling slowly in love. She had let him believe he was her secret, cherished thing, not a transaction, but a romance that had to stay hidden for legal reasons. He had no idea she was engaged. He had no idea there was a wedding to another man 3 weeks away. He found out the same way I found out about him, a fracture in a story that had been too smooth for too long. In his case, Nicole had gone suddenly cold and evasive after our confrontation, canceling their calls, going quiet for days, and a friend of his who'd always been skeptical had done some searching and turned up enough to make him call the number he somehow had for me. And when he called, it was to confirm the thing he already suspected and couldn't bear, that the woman he'd been quietly building a future with in his mind had been running the identical con on someone else, in the opposite direction, the whole time. We compared notes. It was surreal. Two men on opposite sides of the world, who had nothing in common except that we'd both loved the same person and both been lied to by her and tailored, opposite lies. To me, she'd said Adnan was just paperwork, nothing, a transaction. To him, she'd said I didn't exist, and he was her real, secret love. She'd told each of us the exact lie that would keep us where she needed us. The same skill, aimed in two directions. Near the end of the call, Adnan said something quiet that has stayed with me. He said, "I am sorry. I did not know there was another person she was hurting. In my country, we say a liar's house has many doors. I did not know I was only one of the doors. Then he thanked me, and we wished each other something like peace. And we hung up, two strangers who would never speak again, but who had, for 1 hour, been the only two people on earth who fully understood each other. I put the phone down and realized the decision Patricia had left me with had just changed shape entirely. Here's why. Before Adnan's call, reporting Nicole felt simple. She'd committed a crime. She'd used me. She deserved consequences. Clean. But after the call, I understood that reporting the marriage fraud wouldn't only fall on Nicole. It would fall on Adnan too, maybe harder. He was the foreign national. His status, his ability to stay, his entire attempt at a life in a new country, all of it was built on a marriage that a federal investigation would incinerate. Nicole had used him just like she'd used me, and if I brought the whole thing down, the person who'd pay the steepest price might be the other man she'd deceived, not the woman who'd done the deceiving. I sat with that for the second of my 2 weeks. I'm not going to pretend I reasoned my way to something noble. Part of me wanted to burn it all down. There's a version of me that picked up the phone and reported everything and felt righteous doing it, and I understand that version. And some of you would have chosen him, and I don't think you'd be wrong. But I kept coming back to what kind of man I wanted to walk out of this as. Nicole's entire operating system was the belief that a lie doesn't count if no one sees the damage, that reality is only what the other person can perceive. I did not want to become a man who used the truth as a weapon the way she'd used lies as a tool. I didn't want my first act as a free man to be aiming the machinery of the federal government at another one of her victims to get at her. So here's what I actually did. I told Patricia I wasn't going to report it myself. Instead, I gave Adnan everything I had, every document, every screenshot, and I told him the truth about his own exposure, which Nicole had never told him, so that he could make informed decisions to protect himself and, if he chose, to dissolve the marriage cleanly on his own terms. I put the power in the hands of the other person she'd lied to, instead of keeping it as my own weapon. What he did with it was his to decide. Last I heard, he'd quietly ended the marriage and stepped away from the whole thing, choosing to build his life through legitimate means rather than on a foundation she'd poisoned. I respect that more than I can say. And Nicole? I never reported her. But I also never protected her again. When her business partner asked me, months later, in a careful roundabout way, whether I knew anything about some legal issues, I didn't lie for her. I just said they should ask Nicole directly. I was done being the wall around her secrets. The prenup she'd wanted me to sign was designed to make me her shield. In the end, the most complete revenge I never took was simply refusing, ever again, to stand between Nicole and the truth. She tried to reach me for a while. Long texts, then short ones, then a voicemail where she cried and said she'd made a mistake, and that what we had was the real thing, and the rest was just survival, just business, just a thing she did that had nothing to do with her heart. It was, I'll admit, a good voicemail. If I'd heard it before I read page 4, it might have worked. But I learned by then that Nicole's most sincere-sounding words were simply her most carefully chosen ones, and that the tears were real without the sentiment behind them being true. She was crying, I think, over losing me, which is not the same as being sorry for what she did. I didn't answer any of them, not out of cruelty. I just had nothing left to say to a person who'd never once, in 4 years, said a true thing to me for free. If any part of this is landing in a place you recognize, stay with me for one more minute. This last part is the part one actually want you to hear. I want to go back to the folder. She slid a folder across the table and said, just in case. And I slid one back 3 weeks later. For a long time, I thought the symmetry was the point, that the story was about turning her own move against her, the neat justice of it. But that's not what I take from it now. What I take from it is the phrase itself. Just in case. She wanted a prenup just in case our marriage failed. And the whole time, she was the reason it already had. The catastrophe she wanted to insure against wasn't some future unknown. It was her, sitting right there, smiling. We spend so much energy protecting ourselves against the disasters we can imagine, the future ones, the ones that come from outside, that we miss the one already living in the house, already sharing the bed, already sliding paperwork across the table with a smile. Here's what I actually learned, and it's not trust no one, because that's a coward's lesson and it just makes you Nicole in a different outfit. What I learned is that the willingness to look is not the same as the absence of trust. For 4 years, I thought that not looking was how I proved I loved her. Real love, I told myself, doesn't investigate. But that's backwards. I didn't not look because I trusted her. I didn't look because I was afraid of what looking might cost me. That's not trust. That's fear wearing trust's clothes. I read page for carefully. That's the whole reason I'm the man telling you this story instead of the man who found out 5 years into a fraudulent marriage. One clause, one careful reading. The willingness to say, "What's that about?" and then actually go find out instead of accepting the smooth answer. It saved my life, or at least the shape of it. So look, not with suspicion, not with a detective's cold eye ruining every good thing you have, but with the ordinary, adult willingness to let the answer be real. The people who actually love you can survive being seen clearly. It's only the ones running a con who need you to keep your eyes closed. I'm okay now, in case you're wondering. Better than okay. There's someone new, eventually, though that's a different story for a different day. What I'll tell you is that this time, when she opens up her life to me, I look. And every single time, there's just more of her there. That's what it's supposed to feel like. I didn't know that before. I know it now. If this story meant something to you, share it with 5 people who might need it. Leave me a comment and tell me, would you have reported her, or would you have done what I did? I read every one. And tell me what you want us to talk about next. We're here every day, telling the true ones.